2022, bicentennial of our independence. 200 years of Brazil established as a sovereign country over its lands. It's curious to think that between us and the beginning of this new age, only 2 complete generations have passed. To commemorate it, and I hope more years of our independence, beginning this mountain prepared Brazil, 200 years of history. Come with us and enjoy these minutes of pure entertainment. Fearing the advance of French imperialism over all Europe, whose monarchies were weakened, giving to the force of Napoleon Bonaparte, Don Juan makes one of the most sordid political maneuvers at that time: the transfer of the Portuguese court to Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro. As he was the first European monarch who, due to a risky situation, set foot on colonial lands, Don Juan brought several advances. Brazil was elevated to the status of a kingdom, integrating the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and Algarve. But Lisbon, without its king, begins to stir, generating some political insurrections. For this reason, Don Juan VI is forced to leave Brazil and his son, Pedro. Shortly after, receiving for the Portuguese court an update on the status of Brazil, which would return to being a colony, Prince Dom Pedro reacts.
By my blood, my honor, and my God, I swear to bring about freedom to Brazil, independence or death.
The 7th of September of that year would mark our entire history. That had been, without a doubt, one of the most solemn moments for the Brazilian nation. However, not everything can always go well. Political intrigues caused by the immensity of the country generated the weakening of the emperor's image, who, in the following 9 years, had to face Confederation of the Equator, an union between the northeastern provinces that declared war on the empire. Their much desired autonomy vanishes along with their forces, where they lose the war against Pedro. Cisplatin War, and Brazilian province claimed by the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata. Militarily defeated, Pedro still resists the idea of crediting the region to Argentina, thus generating the independent state of Uruguay. In addition with his political life, Pedro also had an intimate life, and in the first year of the war, he got a child. God give you a son, Pedro. The years passed, and in 1828, with the end of the Cisplatin War, Pedro's image wasn't the best, due to the economic crisis, territory lost, and laws made with England. The people, both Brazil and resident Portuguese, were far from their emperor. Divided between the Brazilian and Portuguese thrones, with his image quite worn out by the problems he faced, the emperor took an overwhelming attitude. He abdicated the Brazilian throne. His main reason, however, was to safeguard his daughter's right to reign over Portugal. After the death of his father and his abdication in favor of his daughter Maria, Don Miguel, his brother, takes power from his niece. In response, he decides to travel and unite armies against him. "Are you sure of that, Your Majesty? He's very young. He's already lost his mother. Now you."
I am sure what I'm asking. I entrust him to you, because I know he will be well tutored and instructed in everything he needs. My dear son and my emperor, I thank you very much for the letter you wrote me. I could barely read it because the tears were so many that I couldn't see. Now that I find myself, despite everything, a little more relaxed, I do this to thank you for hours, and to assure you that as long as I live, the longings will never be extinguished in my torn heart. To leave children, culture, and friends, there can be no greater sacrifice, but to live honor unblemished, there can be no greater glory. Always remember your father, love yours and my country, follow the advice given to you by those who take care of your education, and tell that the world will admire you, and that we will be filled with pride for having a rough son of the country. I return to Europe. This is necessary for Brazil to settle down, as God allows, and for the future to reach the degrees of prosperity of which is capable. Farewell, my beloved son, and receive the blessing of our Father, who lives longing and with no more hope of seeing.
The following 90 years would be very conflicting for Brazil. Pedro couldn't reign, for he was only 5 years old. So, in his place, some men took turns, and what was known as the Regent's period. More uprising and separatist movements broke out, as did political intrigue. Next week we're going to start studying the 2 times, Your Majesty. From 7 am or immediately after your breakfast, until that time. Then we return at 3 p.m. Mr. José Bonifácio de Andrade Silva. Yes? You're under arrest by orders of the Minister of Justice, Liriano Coutinho, accused of conspiring against the order, trying to bring Pedro de Alcântara back to the country.
As I said, this period was very troubled. Bonifácio's arrest and complete exclusion was only a point close to everything that had been caused by the regents.
There were 5 major insurrections that took place in this period: Balaiada, Cabanage, War of the Rex, Revolt of the Malês, and Sabinada. Little Pedro, with a lonely and unhappy childhood, who could not be without a tutor, was delegated by the Marquis of Tanhayan, Manuel Inácio de Andrada. In 1840, on the verge of total collapse, the regent Araújo Lima faces uncontrolled opposition from the liberals in the chamber. United, they formed the Majority Club. They intended to anticipate the accession of Pedro to the throne, when he could only be 18 years old. Now, at 14, he was acclaimed as the solution to Brazil's political and social problems. The emperor, at the age of 17, already knew that Brazil was above him, even if it cost him all his wishes. At the end of the same year, after being married by proxy, the day arrives when Pedro meets his wife, Dona Teresa Cristina.
I need to see her. Ah! Esse é vida.
The years passed and, despite the arranged marriage, Pedro generated heirs to the nation. There were 4 children with Empress Teresa Cristina, but the males died. First, Afonso Pedro, aged 2, and 2 years later, Pedro Afonso, also aged 2. However, Pedro didn't allow himself to be shaken by the departure of his children, because he had the weight of Brazil on his back. Known as a patron of the art and sciences, the emperor brought several investments to the nation, opened schools and promoted public and social policies. His government was marked by the consolidation of the united Brazil, of peace and improvement. He matured and brought full sovereignty, be able to face Queen Victoria on the Christ question. His government had indeed been consolidated.
But there were 2 things that shocked the imperial government.
I can't believe Solano loves still there. Right in Mato Grosso, along the increase. What a mess!
The other, as we already know, was his fight against slavery, which he considered a nation shame. After the invasion, the Paraguayan army headed south, crossing Rio Grande do Sul and advancing the province of Corrientes in Argentina to seize the Uruguayan government and hand it over to its supporters. This maneuver by Solano was able to unite Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay in the so-called Treaty of the Triple Alliance. Officially signed on May 1st, 1865, its intents were to defeat Solano and make the Paraguayan government pay compensation to the 3 countries for the damage caused. Between October and November of that same year, the coalition won the war, expelling Solano. However, this war took on a new phase. Now the Triple becomes the invader who hunted Solano's head. Desperately, the dictator, without resources and soldiers, decided on August 16, 1869, to assemble troops of children, adolescents, and women and send to face the Brazilian soldiers. This battle, known as the Battle of Campo Grande, left a total of 2,000 Paraguayans dead against only 26 of the allies. The war only ends when Solano was killed in March 1870 by Brazilian soldiers in the Battle of Cerro Corá. For Solano and Paraguay, death and destruction. For Pedro and Brazil, wear and tear and opposition.
With the war came new internal conflicts. The army rose and wanted a greater participation in political decisions. According to they, Pedro didn't pay attention to them, and that's why they dressed up as Republicans. These strayed people joined the slaveholders and landowners who expressed aversion to the monarch and the person of the emperor directly because the abolitionist laws passed in Congress.
Pedro, nonetheless, couldn't fail to invest in the country, bringing the whole of society to a much more civilized and industrially developed sphere. For this, he had the help of the British who, despite having only commercial interests in relation to consumerism, pressured Brazil to end the slave trade and to increasingly reduce its slave system.
I'm sorry that Brazil has to put up with unprincipled people. Isabel. I'm afraid I have to leave such a difficult place to be held.
Daddy, the mouths of the people. In Brazil we warn you, and as for me, don't worry, God will guide me as he was with you. Pedro was already extremely weakened and tired. He didn't show claws to defend the monarchy, and even though he loved his daughter, he knew that traditionalism made him weak in this war for not having male heir.
The monarch's very serious health forced him to travel. In Milan twice, he almost died, but before his life was gone, he is able to receive the happiest of the news.
Your Highness will fear always, but lose the throne. If I had 1,000 thrones, 1,000 thrones I would give. Coming back, Pedro was warmly received by the people, and the entire imperial family received an intense ovation on account of the Golden Law. The streets of Rio, or even other regions of the country, joined in parties and chants because of the abolition. It was the imperial intention to acquire, on behalf of the recently freed people, land in their large estates scattered throughout Brazil, so that they could establish their homes. However, before these plans were carried out, a revolution fueled by positivism and armed with authoritarian ideas broke Brazil.
Marshal Deodoro?
Você tem demora aqui antes. Your time is pequeno, Brasil.
24 hours? Is that all I get for years of dedication? What a mess.
Your ministers have already been demised, and you stand before your president. Yes, I give you just 24 hours for you and your family to go into exile safely. Any longer, I will not be responsible for your safety. From a completely unpopular coup supported by the vilest caste of Brazilian society, the one that defend the imprisonment and exploitation of humans, the Federative Republic of Brazil was founded. First, as a dictatorship, then as an oligarchy, with orders and demands and political favors. In exile, Dona Teresa Cristina died the day after landing in Europe, and Pedro, spending his last days weekend in a cheap hotel paid for by friends and family, couldn't resist for long.
Brazil barely survived the government slashes. It has suffered implosive setbacks, but it still withstands day by day.
We witness the history of a magnificent and melancholic country. We see it grow, crumble, and be reborn, rising again from the ashes. That's our history too. We deal with every loss, and we succeed against adversity. Me, you, we are the Brazilians.